So, I would like to introduce first of all myself. My name is Oleksii Mikheiev. I'm Managing Director, Chief Executive Officer of a middle-sized German CRO. So welcome from Munich. We are working in the Munich area. The company name is Verum Germany. We are mostly specialized in all areas. We're a middle-sized CRO and working in Germany and other European countries, and also focusing on Eastern Europe countries and Central European countries, as well as some far countries like Georgian Republic or Australia. My presentation is about quite actual topic, respiratory tract infection, about clinical trials 2015-20, about trends and actual challenges. My CRO is okay. So we are many years we are specializing in respiratory infection. And so during last years, we saw that significant decreasing of studies in respiratory tract area or in infection diseases. Of course, it was quite interesting trend. Actual trend is that acute viral respiratory tract infection increase rapidly. Particularly in European countries, and also the request from US and North American sponsors. First of all, I would like to analyze the trends of characteristic of RTI clinical trials in all the worlds in 2015 and 19, so the last 5 years. Number of clinical studies according to information from Cochrane and from clinicaltrials.gov, also from the EUDRA-CT, was that number of studies in the world for all studies initiated by industry, by institutions, by governmental, was approximately 1,400. The total number of patients which were involved in these trials, it's close to 500,000, and 63 countries are participated in this trial. You can see in my screen that majority of course trials was for phase 3, but also for phase 2. The main indicators which were investigated last 5 years, also the last 10 years, was mostly childhood cluster diseases related to vaccines, also fungal infections, influenza, influenza vaccine, lower parts respiratory infections, tuberculosis and non-tuberculosis mycobacteria, and of course upper respiratory tract. What are investigated last years? Of course, the first place occupied medications and vaccines, a lot of behavioral studies, procedures, devices, including also non-invasive medical device. We are participated in many studies for biosampling collection, for many US sponsors who developed any tests for respiratory disease and for other diseases, also kidney, to be honest. During last years, diagnostic testing trials increased in several times, and of course other interventions. What was investigated? As I mentioned, the majority was vaccines and drugs. A little bit devices, one study for radiation is also quite interesting, genetic studies and other intervention. We analyzed data from these 1,400 studies and understood that industry was the sponsor number one, 50% for all studies initiated last 5 years. Also, second place occupied different university or other non-governmental organization. Also, I would like to underline that National Institute of Health initiated approximately 6% of the study, and Verum is, my company is selected by National Institute of Health for many studies in European Union. During last 15 years, we are good collaborator for National Institute of Health for many studies, including respiratory. This is more detailed information who was lead sponsors for the last 5 years in respiratory tract infection. As I mentioned, the industry was the main sponsor, particularly for vaccine, 64%, and for all RTIs. The second place, as you can see, for vaccine is National Institute of Health and US Federal. And also other governmental, foreign governmental were the sponsors for RTI vaccine, like German Paul-Ehrlich Institute, for instance. Also, I would like to pay attention that a lot of academic and hospital studies were initiated by them. Who was founded these studies? RTI trials were more likely than other infection diseases or non-infection disease trials to be funded by industry, approximately 45%. And again, the vaccines usually also founded by industry. This slide demonstrates trends of characteristic of sponsorship during last 5 years, and I would say that also for the last 10 years. You can see that involvement in sponsorship declines during last years. For instance, industry decline from 60% of trials till 38% of the 38% of all trials. National Institute of Health is quite stable for sponsorshiping the trials in RTI, and a little bit trends is a little bit sponsorship increased by institutions and hospitals or individuals as sponsorship. There's also quite interesting trends for aging of patients who participate in clinical trials, and now we have the really gap or lack of information related to efficacy of clinical trials for elderly people. During last not only 5 but 10 years, RTI trials were more frequently restricted to children than were infection disease trial overall. And for elderly subjects, its restriction is quite big, 63%. The causative factor, which learned last years, of course, not viral infection, unfortunately. Majority of clinical trials were focused on bacterial, and only small amount of trials, 12%, were focused on viral infection. This trial is more detailed information about viral lower respiratory tract infection trials. They were focused on only 20% of new molecules, and majority of antiviral agents studied for new indications. It was already approved studies, medications. And what is the new trends for RTI trials started now into 2020? We see the increased number of RTI clinical trials, of course, exploding COVID-19 trials. Unfortunately, no new antiviral agents are presented now in newly initiated studies in clinicaltrials.gov. Also, I would like to pay attention that 80% of clinical trials now for trials for RTI, clinical trials for upper RTI, usually with marketed products, already marketed products. Of course, the interest now more often for already authorized biological projects for COVID treatments. And quite interesting trends. Now this pharma and governmental organization like National Institute of Health quite often cooperate for COVID studies. This information I find today. I make some summary. As for 24th of April, as for today, we identify approximately 82 studies initiated by industry or National Institute of Health. A majority of trials in phase 2 now, and of course phase 3. NIH has now 5 active studies at that moment, including ORCHID, for instance. Maybe you know this study for treatment of COVID. And quite interesting that a pharmaceutical agent which tested now for COVID, it's not a new. The majority of studies now with lopinavir and ritonavir for HIV infection. This group of medication is for treatment of HIV, and for medication which was created for Ebola or another RNA and influenza virus. Of course, anti-malarial treatments is under investigation at the moment and quite successful. The second group, third group is immunosuppressant, or better to say biological, like different kind of EMABs, and also quite interesting, not only immunosuppressants, but also immunomodulators or immunostimulators are in studies at that moment. It's quite interesting trends. Another pharmaceutical agents, and this slide demonstrates, as for now, as for today, distribution of studied treatments. Of course, first place occupied antiviral. It's 15 trials at the moment, but now we are talking only about trials initiated by industry and National Institute of Health. Biological therapy is first place now, 20 studies, and anti-malarial studies, 7-8 studies initiated by industry and others. Vaccines, to be honest, independently that media informed that approximately 65 clinical trials with vaccine are active now. According to clinicaltrials.gov, there are only 4 studies with vaccine against COVID-19 running now. And at the end of my presentation, I would like to show quite interesting information which I learned from media. My initial academic background is clinical virology. Then I became dermatologist. And in opinion of many virologists, antiviral therapy, this is the future for COVID, but not development of vaccine. And pharma and other researchers will definitely focus on development of new antiviral therapy with direct and indirect influence to the virus. But vaccine is also, according to the media, there are approximately 68 vaccines project now in development. What kind of conclusions could I make? That's of course COVID pandemic will positively increase number of trials of new molecules for antiviral drugs. And this is the future for treatments of any viral diseases. Thanks a lot for your attention. Do you have any questions?